Well, good morning, everyone, and a very big thank you on behalf of the Heinrich Foundation to the organizers of today's event for their invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. What I'd like to do, if I may, is take a few minutes and talk to you a bit about global order at the tipping point, and in particular, trade in a post-free trade world. Now, we're in the process of moving from an era of deep economic integration and largely cooperative relationships characterized by pro-free trade policies and pro-globalization policies. We are moving now towards a post-free trade world. Now, if we're to safely navigate these waters, we're going to require an extremely clear vision. Unfortunately, that vision is lacking. So what will trade look like in a post-free trade world? What will our approach to trade be? How will the patterns of our trade relationships be determined? And what about trade governance? How will we govern the trade relationships, if at all? Or are we moving towards sort of a law of the jungle, big fish eats the little fish scenario as existed before 1948? What about the business government interface on trade issues? The way that business and governments are now interacting is changing radically. We also have to think about non-trade issues, which now need to be included in trading relationships. When I started my career as a trade negotiator in 1986, we never could have imagined the range of issues, labor, environment, inclusion, equity, etc., that are now being discussed in the context of trade negotiations and trade relationships. Thus far, at least, the debate and the discussion and the establishment of a clear vision on all these points has not been adequate. Now, the United States, of course, was the primary architect of and the driving force behind our existing global trade system, which was established in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. Now, admittedly, a tremendous amount has changed since 1948, when our existing system was first established, but it is still incumbent on the United States, Europe, and others, because of the unique roles that they play, to spell out a new vision for how we are going to approach globalization and trade in a post-free trade world. Now, although you wouldn't know it, certainly from listening to the national dialogue in the United States, trade has hit its most important inflection point, and I would say its most perilous inflection point in 3/4 of a century. Most of the prosperity and relative peace we've experienced over the last 7 decades has been built upon the back of a deeply integrated, cooperative global trading system. But today, thanks to rising geopolitical stresses and strains, a hopelessly out-of-date trade rule book, and rising questions about some of the social and economic trade-offs associated with free trade, that system is disintegrating before our eyes. And we are now at a tipping point, and we are entering a very new era, an era characterized by adversarial trade relationships in an increasingly fragmented rather than global trading system. I think we're going to see it increasingly fragmented along geopolitical lines. Now, given what's at play, unfortunately, US leaders and European leaders and other leading trade nations are failing to adequately debate, define, and articulate a new modus vivendi for trade in this new era. Now, to be clear, we can skip the empty bromides and the platitudes. So I'm not talking about saying, well, we need to, quote unquote, get tough with China, or we are going to pursue a worker-centric trade policy, or we are going to establish, quote unquote, resilient supply chains. These are really platitudinous comments that don't really mean a lot. We can skip those. We've already had enough of that talk already. What is really needed in Europe, in the United States, and elsewhere is an adult conversation about what are the trade-offs, What are the risks? What are the costs of this new era and this new approach to trade that we're entering? And we need to establish a new vision for how we're going to approach trade. Now, leaders are supposed to lead, and given the historical inflection point we're at, we would have hoped to have seen more by now. But particularly in the United States, if we look at the United States Congress, Congress has been more than happy to hand off the trade hot potato to the executive branch. Congress is not even going to debate and vote on the only prominent trade initiative launched thus far by the Biden administration, and that is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Agreement. That's going to be implemented by executive orders. And even the recently passed CHIPS Act to provide massive subsidization to the semiconductor industry, most of the trade provisions had to be stripped out of that proposal before it could be debated, voted on, and passed into law. Now, if we move down to the other end of Pennsylvania, to the White House, the Biden administration has made it very clear, unfortunately, that trade is simply not a high priority. The trade representative, Ambassador Catherine Tai, has talked quite a bit about the need for a new approach to trade, but that discussion really hasn't been front and center the way it needs to be. The Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, has talked about friendshoring, but she's really sidestepped any discussion about what the possible costs that might be associated with friendshoring. The Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo, has taken a very hardline approach to technology trade with China, but again, she hasn't really gotten into any discussion of the potential risks or the potential blowbacks associated with that. So clearly, it's time for a more substantive debate, a more substantive discussion to arrive at this new approach to trade. Now, if anybody asked me for my humble opinion, I would be more than happy to sketch out the terms and reference for this debate and discussion which needs to take place in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere. And I would start off with 5 critical points that need to be examined very closely. Number 1 is, what is the operating thesis behind this new approach to trade? What are the foundational assumptions and the strategic calculations? Let's be very clear on one specific point. Are we now renouncing the previous idealized vision for what free trade and globalization will bring? This idealized vision has been driving trade relationships for at least the past 40 years. Are we now saying that that's no longer operative? Or are we saying that some parts of that vision remain valid, other parts of that vision are no longer valid and have to be modified? And very important point here, if we no longer believe that a deeply integrated and truly global trade system is possible or desirable, then it's incumbent upon us to define, okay, so what's next? If the old system is no longer desirable or operative, what is the new system that we're moving towards? Are we moving towards some sort of a messy hybrid system? My personal opinion is I think we probably are heading towards a messy hybrid, which will be a globalized system in some respects, but a fragmented system in other respects. So we need to clearly understand this. How will this work, and what are the dividing lines? The second issue, which I think this discussion absolutely needs to tackle, is what I would refer to as sort of the 800-pound gorilla in the room. How will the US-China trade relationship be handled? Now, it should be obvious to anyone who has their eyes open, certainly the US and China, to a lesser extent, perhaps Europe, are moving towards some level of decoupling. The only question is how far along that spectrum we're going to progress. To what extent will we see a decoupling with China? So if you think of decoupling as a spectrum, and at one end of the spectrum, you have deep integration and high levels of trade and investment. And at the other end of the spectrum, virtually no integration, virtually no trade, virtually no investment, where are we going to end up on that spectrum? And what will be the calculus that will determine if we move this far or this far or this far? Let's spell things out clearly. If we are saying some trade with China is okay and some trade with China is not okay, we need to articulate the logic. If it is not okay to sell semiconductors to China, explain why it is okay to sell soybeans. What is the logic? What is the logic? And then we need to anticipate that for any moves the United States, Europe, other countries might take, there will be counter moves by China. So we need to think a few moves down the chessboard. And after the chess moves and the counter moves have been executed, where are we going to be? Where are we going to be? We need to be able to see the full chessboard. The third issue, I think, is especially important for the simple reason it's not really getting the level of discussion I think it needs, and that is what should be expected of multinational corporations in this new era. Now, traditionally, companies, in particular, I would say American companies, have operated as free agents. They have made their trade and investment decisions, their sourcing and investment decisions based entirely on economic efficiency and profitability, even when those decisions ran contrary to the national interests of the United States or the EU. So the question we need to ask, is that still okay in this new era? Are we still comfortable with that approach? Now, it's interesting to note that in 1953, the president of General Motors, Charles Wilson, very proudly testified before the United States Congress, and he famously said, "What's good for America is good for General Motors, and what's good for General Motors is good for America." Now, if we fast forward to our current day, and we try to imagine Tim Cook making a similar comment today about Apple, it would seem absurd. He would be laughed out of Congress if he ever made a similar comment about Apple today. So these are complex issues. There are arguments on either side. Let's have the discussion. Let's have the debate so that we're clear on what should be expected of multinational corporations in this new era. The fourth issue I would suggest we need to think about very carefully is the application of values to trading relationships absolute or is it relative? As we've all seen, values are increasingly entering into the trade discussion. So what are the standards? What are the rules of the game? What are the exceptions? In what instances will some countries be given a free pass? Let's be clear on this. If we say, for example, that the importation of running shoes should be banned from a country that has a questionable human rights practice, then by the same logic, are we also saying that the importation of oil from a country that has a similar human rights record should also be banned? Or do we say, no, that's ridiculous. We can learn to manage disruptions in running shoes, but oil is too important. Well, if that's the case, lay out what are the standards, what are the rules and rules of the road, and how will our values be applied, and in which cases will our values not be applied. And then the final point, I think it's very important to get right, to have a full debate, discussion, and reach some type of a resolution. What is the overarching objective of trade? Now look, for the past 40 years, if you ask me, I could very clearly define the objective of trade. It is about economic efficiencies. It is about profitability for companies. It is about lower prices for consumers. It is about economic development for less developed countries. And it's about ideally the encouragement, fostering a greater likelihood for peace. But where are we today? Is that still the objective? Is that still the overarching objective of trade? Does that still apply in today's world, in this new era that we're moving into? Or is trade really about national security? Is trade really about acquiring and maintaining technological superiority? Is trade about alliances, building alliances with countries that share your geopolitical outlook or a common set of societal values? Is trade becoming just another stage upon which geopolitical rivalries will be played out? Let's be clear. And I think as we articulate an approach to trade in this new world, we have to paint a very clear picture of where we're headed. People cannot buy into a vision if they cannot see the vision. So I think it's incumbent on the United States, the EU, others to say, if our new strategy succeeds, if our new approach to trade succeeds, this is what the world is going to look like in 5 years, in 10 years, and in 25 years. Now, look, wherever this debate, wherever this discussion might lead, I think it is going to be beneficial for all parties involved, and certainly for the global trading system, to have a much clearer picture of what is the operational and the physical base, the philosophical basis upon which trading relationships are going to be conducted in the years to come. Today, that is totally lacking, and the ambiguity that exists around all these issues I've talked about only serves to heighten the risks. In any case, we're at an important global tipping point. We need to focus on having an adult conversation on some of these issues. I'll draw my comments to a close there, and I'll look forward to any comments or questions you might have during our Q&A session. Thank you very much.